In this essay, I'll be debunking some bizarre arguments people make to undermine transgender people. I'm going to introduce the arguments with a bit of satire. It uses a video clip from a transphobic news segment. If you don't want to watch it, just jump to this part of the video. You don't need to watch it to follow along. Welcome to TNN, Transphobic News Network, the only news station that tells the same transphobic joke every hour on the hour. But first, Liz Wheeler with a fresh new made-up reason to be afraid in her running segment, I don't understand and I don't want to.
First we had transgender. As a society, we accepted this. Then we got transracial. Rachel Dolezal, the white woman who pretended to be black and even led a chapter of the NAACP until she was exposed and thrown out. There's more. After transgender and transracial, we got transabled. Yeah, this one's really messed up. Physically healthy people who feel they should have been born disabled. A man in Great Britain cut off his arm because he felt like an amputee. A woman in North Carolina poured drain cleaner in her eyes because she felt blind. Where does this end? Can a child be an adult because she feels like a grown-up? Can a teenager buy alcohol because he identifies as over 21 years of age? Can a grown man attend kindergarten because he identifies as a 6-year-old girl? Can a child spend the day at doggy daycare instead of school because the child feels like a canine? Just something for liberals to think about before they push the boundaries of identity politics past the point of no return. When you sacrifice objectivity and reality like transgender, transracial, transabled, transspecies, transaged, you get cultural absurdity.
Real wrath of God type stuff.
Exactly.
Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies. Rivers and seas boiling.
40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes. The dead rising from the grave.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
Enough, I get the point.
That video was obviously the extreme version of the transphobic argument. I think it is pretty easy to dismiss because it is so hyperbolic. Supporting transgender identities doesn't logically require us to support transracial, transabled, or transspecies identities. It doesn't mean transgender people are a slippery slope to cultural absurdity, whatever she thinks that means. This segment was from 5 years ago, but Ted Cruz just used a similar argument when trying to derail a Supreme Court confirmation hearing. And even though Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson responded to the question really well, I hope it will still be useful to debunk the argument in detail. And it's also an excuse to learn more about the diversity of human identities. In this first section of the essay, I will show how to quickly reject the transphobic premise and keep the conversation on transgender rights. And later in the essay, I will give responses to each specific comparison. I'll cover transabled, transracial, transaged, transspecies, and I'll go even further and cover some identities that Liz Wheeler didn't even mention. Sadly, the scaremongering is nothing new. Reactionaries have a history of acting like Chicken Little every time the status quo is challenged. Interracial marriages and desegregation scared them, and they tried to scare other people too by claiming race mixing is communism. Women demanding the same rights as men scared them too, so they tried to scare other people by claiming feminism encourages women to kill their children and practice witchcraft. Here's an old one. During the suffragette movement, the fear was if women could vote, men would lose the right to vote because men would be busy doing all the laundry. And of course, there is the ridiculous fear that gay rights will inevitably bring down Western civilization, or whatever is happening on this book cover. Historical context shows how moral panics are mostly nonsense, but still, the new moral panic about transgender identities might actually be convincing to someone. It's helpful to know how you can quickly reject the importance of the comparisons and refocus the discussion back on transgender rights. The easiest way to dismiss the comparison is to point out that they're two separate things. As T1J puts it, just because two things share a property doesn't mean that they work exactly the same way. It's comparing apples to oranges, or more accurately, it's comparing trans apples to trans oranges. Just because transgender and transracial share the prefix trans doesn't mean one implies the other. Catholics believe in transubstantiation, which is the idea that their crackers turn into the body of Christ. Just because Catholics believe in transubstantiation doesn't mean that they're hypocritical for being transphobic. It's not very convincing to say, if I have to respect your bread's identity as the body of Christ, you need to respect my gender identity. A transphobic Catholic can reject that comparison just as you can reject the comparison of transgender and transracial. The transgender community is also different from all the other identities in two key ways. The history of transgender people go back millennia and have examples in dozens of cultures. and there are also millions of transgender people. The other identities don't have a long history and are incredibly rare by comparison. Those 4 responses reject any of the transphobic comparisons. Now, before we move on to looking at each of the comparisons one at a time, I'll start with some basics on transgender people. In order to introduce the fundamentals, I'll answer 3 questions about gender transitioning. Does it improve well-being? Are the alternatives to transitioning effective? And are the risks acceptable? Does it improve well-being? Well, here's a meta-analysis of gender transition studies. We conducted a systematic literature review of all peer-reviewed articles published in English between 1991 and June 2017 that assess the effect of gender transition on transgender well-being. We identified 55 studies that consist of primary research on this topic. 93% found that gender transition improves the overall well-being of transgender people, while 7% reported mixed or null findings. We found no studies concluding that gender transition causes overall harm. So there's a growing scientific consensus that gender transitions improve well-being. Are the alternatives to transitioning effective? Despite the attention given to gender confirmation surgery, gender transitioning usually doesn't involve surgery. Some transgender people are happy with just getting hormone therapy. For others, transitioning means changing the way they dress and merely socially transitioning. And the alternative to letting someone transition in the way that they want is typically called conversion therapy. It is an attempt to convert their gender identity closer to their biological sex. But this kind of treatment is increasingly rejected by professionals and made illegal by governments. A study of 19,000 transgender people showed that exposure to conversion therapy is associated with adverse mental health outcomes in adulthood. So there's also a growing scientific consensus that the alternatives to gender transitioning aren't effective. Are the risks acceptable? In a 2015 survey of nearly 28,000 people conducted by the US-based National Center for Transgender Equality, only 8% of respondents reported detransitioning, and 62% of those people said they only detransitioned temporarily. The most common reason for detransitioning, according to the survey, was pressure from a parent, while only 0.4% of respondents said they detransitioned after realizing transitioning wasn't right for them. And remember, transitioning isn't always surgery, so detransitioning isn't always surgery either. It usually just means no longer taking hormones. So there is also a growing scientific consensus that the risks are in line with the risks of many medical interventions that we don't give a second thought to. This is a very complex subject, and I'm leaving a lot of nuance out. For some great in-depth commentary and research on the subject, I highly recommend Mia Mulder's video, Puberty Blockers Are Safe. As far as we know, get over it. Now that I've hopefully shown how strong the case is for transgender people, let's see how it compares to the case for transabled people. At first, when I heard about people that wanted to amputate healthy parts of their bodies, I thought they just needed therapy. And I was definitely offended by the term transabled. It seemed like just another way for people to be transphobic. And I thought it wasn't valid because the argument for accepting transgender people's identities is so much stronger than accepting transabled people. After all, desiring to have a limb amputated is desiring to have a condition that only rarely occurs naturally, as opposed to desiring to be accepted as a man or a woman, which is desiring to be something that half of the population already is. It is a lot easier to imagine someone having a mismatched gender because of hormones or genetics than a mismatched image of the number of limbs they should have. This is why being transgender is easier to accept than being transabled. But there is growing evidence for accepting transabled people too. Another term for the condition is body integrity dysphoria, or BID. It was not included in the DSM-5, but it has been included in the ICD-11. It isn't classified as a delusion because they aren't deluded into thinking their limb isn't theirs. They know it is their limb, it just doesn't feel right. The largest study of transabled people I found was of 52 subjects. Age at onset was during childhood or early adolescence for all but one. Over 95% of them wanted a limb amputated, but other forms of BID include wanting to be blind, deaf, or just having fingers or toes amputated. With that brief introduction out of the way, let's answer the same 3 questions I did for gender transition and see if they fit for body integrity dysphoria. Does it improve well-being? It isn't physically painful. Instead, it feels like constant gnawing frustration. They describe it as feeling incomplete. 44% of that study of 52 people reported that their desire interfered with leisure activities, social functioning, or occupational functioning. The feeling is so strong that it has led people with BID to injure themselves, potentially fatally, to force doctors to finish the amputation. When the negative sensation is that strong, it makes a very strong case that amputation improves the well-being of people with BID. Are the alternatives to transitioning effective? None of the 34 subjects that did psychotherapy reported it reduced the intensity of the desire for amputation. None of the 21 subjects that had taken psychotropic medication reported any appreciable effect from the medication on the desire for amputation, although mood often improved. Only one patient reported some decrease in intensity of the desires, which she attributed to doing body work, focusing on remaining connected when their legs are being touched. So that was the most hopeful sign of treatment instead of amputation that I found. One person saying that they were able to slightly decrease the intensity of the desires. That's not enough of a reason to think that therapy is an effective way to treat their dysphoria. Right now, there aren't any good alternatives to relieve the suffering of people with BID, but there are possibilities that are worth investigating. There is transcranial direct current stimulation, a non-invasive technique that delivers a low voltage electrical current to a patient through 2 electrodes on the scalp, which has the possibility of helping with BID. Also, for mild cases of BID, a VR setup could give them relief by letting them see their body as they imagine it. But I don't think people who are suffering greatly from BID should be expected to delay amputation because there might be a solution at some unknown point. So we are still left with no effective treatment besides amputation. Are the risks acceptable? The number of people with BID who have gotten amputations is very small, but none of them regret it. 6 subjects who had an amputation at their desired site reported that following the amputation, they felt better than they ever had and no longer had a desire for amputation. So I began to come around to the idea of labeling people with BID as transabled. After all, some gay people were transphobic and argued against accepting transgender people since they were seen as too strange and would hurt the cause of advancing gay rights. So maybe my negative reaction to the term transabled was misguided in the same way. It seems that BID is an actual form of dysphoria too, and experts say these people meet reasonable standards for rationality and autonomy. So long as no other effective treatment for their disorder is available, surgeons ought to be allowed to accede to their requests. I think it is really helpful to compare BID to phantom limb sensation. Phantom limb sensation is when amputees can still feel their missing limb. Sometimes it feels like their amputated hand is clenching into a fist painfully tight. This is because their body is expecting to feel an arm there, but there isn't one, so it fills in the blank. The mental map of the body isn't matching up with the physical body. You can picture it as 2 layers to an identity, with the physical layer in blue and the mental map of the body in red. When they match up, you can't tell that there's more than one layer. Everything just seems purple. But after an amputation, the body no longer matches the mental map. So now you can see that there are 2 layers even when they overlap. Their physical arm is missing, but the arm in their mental body map is still there. It's not solid purple anymore. You can tell that there's a hidden layer. This mismatch is what causes the sensation. It's the same for transabled people, but the layers are switched. Their arm isn't missing physically, but the arm in their mental body map is. The discomfort comes from mismatching layers. Hopefully at this point I've convinced you that there might be something to this whole transabled thing, and it isn't just some misguided people that are useful props for transphobes. They are people suffering from an actual form of dysphoria. So Liz Wheeler was kind of right in a way. I supported transgender people, and now I also support transabled people. But don't worry, this isn't the point of no return for identity politics sending us over the cliff into cultural absurdity. Just because I can see the evidence for transabled people doesn't mean I must also accept transracial people uncritically. But it also doesn't mean that transracial identity isn't worth consideration. So let's take a look at that now. First off, I need to explain that the term transracial has been taken over from its original meaning. For decades, it only meant adoptees who were raised in families of a different race, and their unique struggles should be talked about more. It can be difficult for racial minorities adopted by white families to assert themselves as their racial identities. And when they do, their identities are often challenged by either white people or the very communities that mirror their racial and ethnic identities. Transracial was already a complex and marginalized identity before the term got appropriated by people who were raised by their biological parents, but still identified as a different ethnicity. 24 adoptees, adoptive parents, and academics signed onto an open letter why co-opting transracial in the case of Rachel Dolezal is problematic. In it, they explain that we need everyone to stop trying to make this new definition of transracial happen. It's not and should not be a thing. Sadly, though, it has become a thing. When people hear the word transracial, Rachel Dolezal comes to mind much more often than adoptees. The linguistic battle over the word transracial is lost. That is why I think it would be strategic to make the distinction between transracial appropriators and transracial adoptees. Rachel Dolezal is a transracial appropriator. Her black siblings are transracial adoptees. Now, onto dismissing the transphobic comparison to transgender people. There's a key difference between race and gender. If Rachel Dolezal had grown up completely isolated from anyone else on a desert island, she wouldn't feel the need to present as a different race. She wouldn't be trying to get a tan on purpose to be darker. But if a transgender person with gender dysphoria had grown up completely isolated on a desert island, they would still have gender dysphoria. A trans man might try to make a chest binder out of palm leaves. Although gender and race are both social constructs, gender is more than a social construct. It is also influenced by biology. And race is actually not influenced by biology. The mainstream belief among scientists is that race is a social construct without biological meaning. People often mistakenly think race has biological meaning, but they're just mistaking race for geographic ancestry. It is possible to estimate the geographic origin of parts of someone's DNA, but it is not possible to determine someone's socially defined race by examining their DNA. The range of genetic diversity of Africans is so wide that one study found that on average, 2 individuals from Africa had less in common with one another than they did with people in Asia or Europe. This amount of genetic diversity in each race shows that all the races are just different combinations of the same genetic variations. Between Africa and Europe, for example, there is not a single absolute genetic difference, meaning no single variant where all Africans have one variant and all Europeans have another one, even when recent migration is disregarded. Biological races do exist for other animals, though. They have groups that are identifiable by separate evolutionary lineages. But this isn't what evolutionary lineages look like for humans. The separate branches are actually braided together. Each connection represents sharing of genes, and all that commonality means humans don't actually have biological races like other animals. Since our distinctions between races don't come from biology, it isn't possible that transracial appropriators were born that way. It is an entirely socialized response. But it is a different story for gender identity. Although it is still useful to point out that gender identity is partially a social construct, biology is still a factor. Studies show the role of biology in gender identity development comes from endocrinology, genetics, and brain studies. If you want to learn more about biology's role in gender, I highly recommend this YouTube video by Forrest Valkai. But we don't need to get into the weeds with biology to understand this. It makes sense that gender would have biological markers, since gender has been an influence on the evolution of our species for millions of years. Ever since we became such social animals and developed self-identities, gender has been a factor in which genes were passed on. Race, on the other hand, has not been a factor in evolution. The social construct of race hasn't even been around for more than 1,000 years. This might sound confusing, but remember, race is different from geographic ancestry. Geographic ancestries have had an effect on evolution because they actually strongly relate to genetics, but race doesn't. And geographic ancestries can help us guess with varying accuracy what someone's race is, but we can't look at someone's DNA and confidently predict their race. So the key takeaway is that racial identity doesn't relate to biology, but gender identity does. Transgender people were born that way. Rachel Dolezal was not. Now, why does it matter that race is purely a social construct? Well, part of the social construct is that you can't change your race. But what if that changed? What if we accepted transracial appropriators? Would that be a problem? Yes, actually, because there's another important difference. A transgender woman can experience sexism just as much as a cisgender woman, but Rachel Dolezal cannot experience racism as much as an actual black person. Someone cannot make themselves more likely to experience the intergenerational health and economic impact of systemic racism simply by identifying as black. Unlike gender inequality, racial inequality primarily accumulates across generations. Transracial appropriation undermines collective reckoning with that injustice. That was a quote from a great article written by Dee Payton and Robin Dembroff, two assistant professors of philosophy. So there is a risk to accepting a white person identifying as black or Asian or Native American. It presents a risk to social justice. If we allow people that aren't living with the consequences of intergenerational racism to be classified as a marginalized racial group, we undermine our ability to track racial inequality. Given the severity of this inequality, we need conceptual and linguistic tools that illuminate populations that inherit this inequality and are thereby entitled to reparations. We believe the importance of preserving these tools vastly outweighs the good of respecting a transracial appropriator's racial self-identification. So this is why transracial appropriators shouldn't be classified as black. You might be thinking, well, is this a reason that trans women shouldn't be classified as women? No, because classifying trans women correctly as women doesn't conceal our ability to track gender inequality. There is a need to balance the goal of respecting the self-identification of transracial appropriators with the goal of achieving racial justice. And since racial inequality is so severe, the choice is clear. But here's a thought experiment. What if someone was a transracial appropriator in 500 AD, well before racism was ingrained into society? If there wasn't a dominant culture, it wouldn't be possible to appropriate anything. Appropriation is harmful when it contributes to the further marginalization of an already marginalized group. And if there wasn't any marginalization, then appropriation wouldn't necessarily be problematic. But that is a pretty theoretical what-if situation. The two key takeaways are that transracial appropriators can't experience intergenerational racism, and so should not be classified as a different racial group since it would obscure the racial inequality that exists today. And transracial appropriators weren't born this way, since race is only a social construct and doesn't have biological meaning. So those two reasons are why transgender people are accepted, but transracial appropriators are not. Okay, Transaged. It's even less of a thing than transracial appropriators. There's only two people that could possibly be considered as transaged, and they're not even transaged. The first one, Stephanie Walsh, doesn't even identify as a different age. She is just a trans woman who knows that she's role-playing as a child to deal with her trauma. She just wants some escapism. She knows she's still an adult. The second so-called transaged person, Emil Rattleband, is a positivity guru in his 70s who says he doesn't feel his age. He wants to be legally 20 years younger on the grounds that he's being discriminated against on a dating app. He's not claiming people are invalidating his identity as a young person. He's just mad younger people don't swipe right on him anymore. So these two people aren't even genuinely claiming to be transaged. Transaged people don't seem to exist. But if they did exist, would they be a danger to anyone? In the video, Liz Wheeler asked, can a child be an adult because he feels like a grown-up? Can a teenager buy alcohol because he identifies as over 21? No. We don't treat children differently because they identify as children. We treat them differently because their brains are still developing and don't have the capacity to be responsible yet. This is like worrying that someone who can't fly a plane will be allowed to land a 747 just because they identify as Sully Sullenberger. Liz Wheeler also asked, can a grown man attend kindergarten because he identifies as a 6-year-old girl? No. Again, the reason children are sent to school isn't because they identify as children. It's because they're growing up and need an education. Assuming an adult already got an education, then there's no reason for them to go to school again, even if they identify as a child. This is all just a very creative version of the fear-mongering that homosexuals are a danger to children. Homosexuality wasn't a slippery slope to allowing child abuse, and neither will transgender rights, or even hypothetical transaged rights. Identity is becoming more flexible, but the ethics of consent and our responsibilities to children are not. In any case, we already have people that don't act their age, older people that feel and act younger than they are, and young people that act more responsible than their peers. Acting a certain age is already very subjective, and it hasn't led us to a slippery slope where everything is subjective. So why would accepting the hypothetical transaged person be any different? They would still be a child in an adult's mind, capable of behaving like an adult in all the responsibilities that come with it. Transspecies people are people that identify as non-human. The differences between transgender identities and transspecies identities are most obvious when you think about the brain. The difference between the brain of a human and that of another animal is massive, so there's no way the consciousness of a dog could exist in the brain of a human. But when you look at humans, men and women's brains do differ slightly, but the key finding is that these distinctions are due to brain size, not sex or gender. Male brains are almost identical to female brains, so it doesn't make sense that transgender identities require the acceptance of transspecies ones. But this community doesn't end with people that identify as animals. They are part of a much larger community, people that identify as elves or dragons or vampires. They call themselves otherkin. It all seems completely ridiculous, I know, but the community isn't completely delusional. One otherkin wrote some good advice to their fellow otherkins. Don't let it go to your head. You're not immortal. You're not royalty in this life. You're not even special just because you're otherkin. You're just different. So don't let it go to your head. Don't fall into fantasies about some future date when the veil will fall, magic will become real, and there will be a war between humans and otherkin. Don't fall into delusions of constant astral battles. Don't mistake fantasy and wish fulfillment for resonance. In short, otherkin are just as human as everyone else. Hold on to that. It keeps you grounded. That was written by someone who identifies as a plural system. That's someone who identifies as being or having more than one individual in a single body. Jarendel Dreamsinger identifies as a hybrid/multi, elf, Elorian, satyr, deer, not goat, dragon, Krenar, Kylin, Jotnar, stag, fictionkin, multiple canons, Gundam Wing, Fullmetal Alchemist, Mega Man X, other/unspecified, multiple/host. When I first learned about otherkin, I could only see them as delusional. But here's an explanation that shifted my perspective on them. Most otherkin believe they are non-human in a spiritual way, or otherwise somehow non-physical, such as from reincarnation, psychology, transspecies dysphoria, or metaphor. So look at it like a religion. Religions can get just as creative. Compare Jarendel Dreamsinger to the most ridiculous parts of religious identities. People who believe in reincarnation are similar to transspecies people because both believe they had past lives as other animals. You might have noticed some of Dreamsinger's identities are fictional characters. People who identify as beings from books or movies are called fictionkin. Religious people think having a really old book is a sign of authority, but just wait a couple thousand years, maybe Gundam Wing will be treated with the same authority as the Bible. And religious people already believe in plural systems, like when God speaks through them or when possessed by a spirit. Also, the Holy Trinity is a classic example of a plural system. Here's God's profile page. My pronouns are he, him, with a capital H. I identify as myself, but also my son, and also a ghost. Jarendel Dreamsinger also advised, use discretion when discussing your otherness. Basically, don't shout that you're otherkin from the rooftops. Your mundane family and you might be a lot happier if they don't know you're a dragon than if they do. Your coworkers, they probably don't want to hear about your past life as an elven princess. Same with your classmates, teachers, friends, etc. They don't necessarily need to know about this aspect of your life. Pick and choose who you tell carefully. Be sure it's someone who will react well, and be sure you have a solid reason for telling them. In the same vein, don't run around online announcing your otherness in non-otherkin venues. People in places like Gaia Online would probably like to just play their game and not be bothered with other members' spiritual beliefs. Would you like to hear the Christian players proselytizing? It's not nice to non-consensually involve bystanders in your spirituality. So transspecies identities can be seen as a religious belief. In the same way, transitions in religious identities are also a form of trans identity. Let's call them trans theists. Christians who are born again go through a big transition in how they identify. So do formerly religious people who become atheist. The term trans theist would apply to both examples, I believe. So I see no reason to treat otherkin differently than evangelical Christians. I wouldn't discriminate against either of them. I'd treat both with equal amount of respect. They are just different kinds of spiritual beliefs. One has been around for a long time, but the other is newer. In conclusion, the main difference is transgender people, unlike otherkin, don't see their identity as spiritual, and science is starting to find physical proof of it in genetics, endocrinology, and brain studies. All of the different identities covered in this essay so far are about how someone identifies in this moment. But there's also the question of how someone identifies themselves through time. It might seem obvious that everyone would identify with their past and their future, but it's a much more complex question for some. After the section on otherkin and plural systems, you probably thought I couldn't possibly have a weirder identity to talk about. But think again. There are people, like the philosopher Galen Strawson, that do not anticipate experiencing their own future. They anticipate someone will experience their next meal, but they don't expect it will be them tasting it. These people identify as having a transient self, as opposed to the more typical enduring self. Galen Strawson defines an enduring self as someone that was there in the further past and will be there in the further future. And he defines a transient self as the opposite, a self that is merely in the present. I think a useful distinction to mention here is the difference between a person and a self. Person refers to the living human being, the body from birth to death. Self refers to the mental experience that person is having. Enduring selves identify as a self that start at birth and end at death. But transient selves identify as a self that doesn't continue for a very long time, and in fact is just one in a chain of selves of the same person that merely pass on the memories of the past experiences to the next self. For example, the person, Galen Strawson, will taste his next meal, but the self of Galen Strawson that buys the ingredients won't be the self that tastes the meal. He anticipates events happening to his person, but doesn't expect it to happen to his self. He doesn't anticipate actually experiencing the future. This might seem like an impossible way to live, not being personally invested in the past or the present, but transient selves do still care deeply about the past and the future. After all, you can still have empathy for other people even though you don't anticipate experiencing their pain. In the same way, transient selves have empathy for their body's future even though they won't be the one experiencing it. This is a very confusing idea, so let me relate it to an experience we all have. When you remember an experience from yesterday, you feel strongly linked to that part of the past. But when you remember a childhood memory from years and years ago, isn't that feeling of connection weaker in a certain way? That's why it is easier to brush aside something embarrassing you did in elementary school compared to brushing aside something embarrassing you did last week. You can say to yourself, I should stop feeling bad for that innocent mistake I made years ago. I was practically a different person back then. That feeling of weakened connection to a past self is what transient selves feel, but much more magnified and applied to recent memories and even future expectations. Hopefully that example helps the enduring selves to understand how transient selves feel. Now to debunk the hypothetical comparison to transgender people. The big difference between a transient self and a transgender identity is that only one is concerned with selfhood through time. Transgender identities don't question the idea of the enduring self. So there's no reason to think that accepting transgender people means you must accept people with transient selves for the same reason. That is the main difference between a transient self and transgender. But there's also a fascinating similarity. They both reveal a hidden layer to our identities. Sex and gender used to be interchangeable because they usually match. But transgender people show us that sometimes our genders don't match our sexes. When gender matches sex, there's no reason to think that they're separate. they look like one layer when they overlap. But when they don't match, it reveals that hidden layer. This is like how people with BID and phantom limb illustrate other layers of our identities, and people with transient selves reveal that person and self are actually two different layers. For people with enduring selves, the two layers match up, but they don't for people with transient selves. A similar mismatch can also be observed in people that have had surgery to disconnect the two hemispheres of the brain. It's a fascinating topic that I've covered in another one of my essays. It's a great concrete example of the brain constructing a narrative for the self and getting it wrong. And I believe split-brain patients aren't the only ones getting the narrative wrong. We are told narratives from an early age, and we also construct narratives about ourselves from an early age too. It is the default view of a self that it continues through time. So when someone realizes that they are transient and not enduring, they have to transition from the default conception of a self. It isn't a transition that might require surgery, medication, change in behavior, or even new pronouns. Although it would be an interesting idea to change your pronouns as someone with a transient self, but only in the past and the future. So when referring to when I took out the trash yesterday, instead of saying I took out the trash, I could say he took out the trash. That is actually how I think about myself anyway, since I personally identify as having a transient self. I don't think I was the one that experienced my past. I just have memories of it. Except I don't feel transient like Galen Strawson does. I've come to the conclusion by looking at the evidence. I still feel like I have an enduring self, but I don't think enduring selves actually exist for anyone. I think everyone has a transient self. When you look at thought experiments about personal identity, or actual experiments with brain surgery patients, or even at what we know about the evolution of the brain, the argument for a transient self seems plausible. Even philosophers that don't accept the idea of a transient self admit that there isn't a convincing argument for an enduring self. This is the broader topic of my YouTube channel. If this interests you, I'd recommend you check out my other essays. Hopefully this essay was helpful in debunking these transphobic arguments. Here is a cheat sheet of all the identities and how to dismiss people equating them to being transgender. Maybe this will be helpful in deflecting transphobic arguments and recentering the conversation back to transgender rights. Speaking of, I'm going to link to this Twitter thread of lesser known organizations that you can donate to help support transgender kids in Texas. They surely need it. Thanks for watching.